In today's video, we're discussing a variety of NHL news topics, including Brent Seabrook's frustration with being a healthy scratch with the Blackhawks the past couple of games. We're also going to take a look and analyze, are the Sharks ready to hit the panic button? And is Doug Wilson maybe going to be making some changes soon? And we have plenty of other tidbits from Elliotte Friedman's latest 31 Thoughts blog with all kinds of trade rumors mentioned in the latest article. We'll jump into all the latest news coming up next. So welcome back to Top Shelf Hockey. As I mentioned, we have a lot to discuss today, and I want to kick things off with Brent Seabrook and the Chicago Blackhawks. Now, as we know, the veteran defenseman has been a healthy scratch for the past couple of games, and he clearly was not too pleased with the situation, recently making some public comments in an interview where he's let that frustration be known, that he felt that he could still be a good NHL player and still has a lot to give for somebody, is what he said. Now, we never really heard of any public mentions about a trade request. This did happen last year as well under new head coach Jeremy Colleton after the change was made. He was a healthy scratch one time last year. I know he wasn't too pleased about it, but seemed to take that one a little bit better, trying to get better. But so far, I guess his own analysis of his play and his speed and overall game, I guess, wasn't quite to the point that he felt it was better than what many others did. So clearly Brent Seabrook is frustrated, which, you know, you can certainly understand. He's been a big part of that team for a long time, was a core member of their championship days, which are certainly passing them by at this point. And Brent Seabrook's contract would certainly make things very difficult for them to move him. I mean, he has a number of years left. He's got 4 years remaining after this year, so 5 counting the current season at $6.875 million. He also has a full no trade clause, which I guess gives him a lot of say if he were to waive to go to another team, if that deal could be made possible. Certainly would be no easy task. Obviously the Hawks would be in a position where they'd probably have to retain some salary or offer some kind of a sweetener. It's not going to be easy, as we talked about a lot during the offseason. We did see some other bad contracts end up getting swapped, which is usually a time when that's more common to happen. Teams usually have more cap space, more flexibility. Rosters are not set, etc. So it's certainly a little bit easier to be done. So can the Chicago Blackhawks find a move and trade Brent Seabrook? It's possible, but very unlikely right now. We'll see what happens with Seabrook, and certainly a situation worth monitoring. I mean, if he goes to Chicago and does request a trade, if he feels that it's best that he does move on, I guess we will see what they can do. But obviously, after being a healthy scratch there for 2 straight games, there's a lot of talk and question marks around his future with the club. If the Hawks can find a way to move that contract, I'm sure they'd love to do that. At this point, Seabrook might welcome it as well. But I guess we will see. Certainly a situation worth monitoring here going forward. Now, as I mentioned as well, are the San Jose Sharks ready to hit the panic button? They've certainly got off to a very poor start. On their recent Eastern tour, going through places like Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa, the Sharks have not played overly well. They're certainly well below what they were expected to be this year. The Sharks were expected to come into the season and be one of the top teams in the Western Conference, possibly even have a shot at being a Stanley Cup contender here. They certainly want to try to accomplish that while they still have a lot of their core pieces in place. They signed Erik Karlsson to a mega contract extension, over $11 million this offseason as well. And so far, things are not going well. Now, they have battled some injuries early on, but I don't really know if that's really a lot to blame here for their incredibly slow start. Brent Burns and Erik Karlsson are not generating the offense like they have in the past. Both of them are getting fewer shots on net themselves than normal, and there's lots of other things going on too. So would Doug Wilson hit the panic button? I don't think he's ready to do that yet. Doug Wilson's proven to be in the past a very patient GM and usually gets a lot done what he wants. He doesn't usually make panic moves. So I don't think we're at that situation. There's been a lot of talk about maybe a coaching change. Would Pete DeBoer be on the hot seat? I guess anything is possible, but Doug Wilson typically does not like to make coaching changes during the season either. So I do think he believes in DeBoer's ability to be a coach. I think after recent comments from some of the players, they seem to believe that the answers are inside their dressing room, and they need better play from a lot of their core players, including Burns and Karlsson, Logan Couture. Their goaltending especially could certainly be better. Both Dell and Jones have sub-900 save percentages, which is a big part of the reason that things are not going well in San Jose. Clearly, that team could play better defensively, but at the same time, they're not getting the timely saves when they need them either. That's a big part of it. I think if Doug Wilson's going to go shopping and make any upgrades to this Sharks team, I think it would be in the net. Now, of course, if you take a look around the NHL, most teams that might consider trading a goalie have goaltenders in similar situations like the Sharks that are struggling and not living up to expectations. You get Jonathan Quick in Los Angeles. You've got Corey Schneider in New Jersey. They're both goalies that have had their names mentioned in trade rumors before, but again, certainly their contracts don't make things favorable. Of course, you get Martin Jones in San Jose. His contract's not great either. Aaron Dell would certainly be a lot more easier to trade because he's not locked up too long term and the big money like the other guys we mentioned here. So perhaps they could maybe look to trade Dell if they're able to bring back another goaltender who might be able to challenge Jones for that number one spot. I mean, that's a possibility unless they did a swap of struggling goalie for struggling goalie. I guess that's remotely possible, but it's not something that we've typically seen happen in the past. Doesn't mean it couldn't happen in the future. And even though there's no direct link from NHL insiders, I can't help but wonder if the Sharks might look to a team like the Pittsburgh Penguins. They have a situation where they're likely going to be moving a goaltender sometime this year, whether it be Tristan Jarry or Casey DeSmith. Both have had their moments in the NHL where they've looked pretty decent. They both have decent runs in the American Hockey League as well. So perhaps they could go the cheaper route, maybe look to swap Dell for one of those guys, or a combination of other moves to land one of those guys from Pittsburgh. The Penguins are one of the few teams I think that actually have some goaltending depth in that situation where they're, it looks obvious that they do want to make a deal. I mean, there are some other possibilities, but you look to a team like Arizona has, Antti Raanta and Darcy Kuemper. Kuemper's played extremely well, and Ranta's not getting as much playing time. Could they maybe look to a team like Ottawa, who's got a couple of veteran goalies, like Anders Nilsson's been playing a little bit better. You get Craig Anderson, or neither one of them are tied up long term. Could they maybe look for, a fresh start in San Jose? It's really hard to say. There's just not a ton of great options out there unless you're willing to go with a younger goaltender or maybe swap struggling goalies, which is, like I said, very uncommon. So what do the Sharks do in your opinion? I'd like to know what your thoughts are. What does Doug Wilson do, and what kind of moves could he make that seem reasonable here in the short term to kind of right the ship in San Jose and get things turned around? Now, as I mentioned, there was all kinds of great tidbits in Elliotte Friedman's latest 31 Thoughts blog that might fuel some speculation on a few items. One being the potential contract and futures of defenseman Alex Pietrangelo of the Blues, as well as Torrey Krug of the Boston Bruins. Now, we saw in the last couple of days here, the Roman Josi extension has finally been completed with the Nashville Predators, setting him up with an 8-year contract, just over $9 million. When I discussed the Josi contract situation and the extension, I mentioned this as well, but Friedman believes that that contract will have a direct impact on those other two guys that are looking for contract extensions. They certainly have, a lot of NHL experience. And Friedman also mentions that the contract negotiations do seem to have heated up with Pietrangelo and the Blues since the Josi contract extension was announced. He's the actual quote he used in his blog was that they're circling each other like two elite cage fighters. So I guess we'll see what happens and if they can get that deal done. In both cases of him and Krug, I really don't see either one being traded. I think each team is in a situation where they want to go for it and try to make another run at a cup if you're the Blues, or in Boston's case, try to get back to the finals and win this time. I don't see either player being on the trade block right now. I think they'll take their chances, try to get them signed, and if they can't, well, they're going for the cup right now. They'll figure that out come the offseason, but it's certainly going to have a big impact based on that Roman Josi contract extension, how those deals end up being finalized, assuming they get done ahead of the NHL playoffs. And if not, well, we'll see what happens with those two players during next offseason. But either way, the Josi contract will be setting some precedents here for them moving forward. Now, staying with the St. Louis Blues, he also went on to talk about the Vladimir Tarasenko injury and how that might impact the Blues, and would they possibly look to add another top-scoring forward to the Blues organization if they can obviously use some long-term injury reserve cap relief if necessary to make it happen. Of course, he referenced a situation back when the Chicago Blackhawks a number of years ago had Patrick Kane out for an extended period of time and it was returned for the playoff run where they were able to use some long-term injury reserve relief and were able to add to their forward group and then bring Kane back for the playoffs. He wonders if Chris Kreider of the New York Rangers would be a good fit. He said in his opinion he would fit in extremely well with the St. Louis Blues. Obviously, Chris Kreider and the New York Rangers are not having a great year. There's been no word of any contract extension talks between his agent as well as the Rangers, so it certainly looks as though that the odds of him being traded by the Rangers by the trade deadline are probably pretty good. I really do think that based on the Rangers season that pretty is likely to happen. So would he be a good fit in St. Louis? I'd certainly love to know what your thoughts are on that. Obviously, the Blues last year proved that being a big, heavy, strong, physical team worked very well for them in the playoffs and helped them capture the Stanley Cup. And Kreider could certainly provide even more of that. He can play the power forward type of role. He's not afraid to go hard to the net. So seriously, I do think he would fit in quite nicely with the St. Louis Blues. Not to say that Friedman has any sources saying that they're actually having any talks, but he does feel that he would be a great fit there should the Rangers decide for sure that they want to make a move. Now, a few other situations worth monitoring as well, one being the Toronto Maple Leafs. Of course, John Tavares appears to be close to returning from injury. It's about 2 weeks now with his broken finger, and he is getting close. I know it was reported today he was taking regular line rushes in practice, and he very well could be returning a little bit sooner than anticipated. Of course, they're also waiting on Zach Hyman's return, which will probably be a little bit later, sometime into November. The Leafs did indicate with an interview with Mike Babcock that Tavares likely would be returning ahead of Hyman. So obviously, depending on their overall cap situation, Hyman's on LTIR, so they will have to make some adjustments and some roster moves to bring him back onto the active roster. And he does mention in this 31 Thoughts blog that one player that they would definitely be interested in moving would be defenseman Martin Marincin. Now, I know earlier in the year, Marincin actually wasn't playing too bad and seemed to be doing half decent, better than in previous years. So it certainly might have generated a little bit of interest. There's always lots of teams looking for depth on defense for longer playoff runs. So I do think Marincin would probably draw some interest from around the NHL. They will have to make some additional moves, including potentially demoting players to the American Hockey League. Some will require waivers, some won't. But between another defenseman like Marincin and other guys, maybe like a Nick Patan, for example, and maybe more, they're likely going to have to move upwards of 3 contracts, because most of the ones they would consider doing aren't making tons of money. So depending on what the Leafs do to bring Hyman back, they're going to end up having to move around at least 2 to 3 players, and Marincin likely would be on his way out if they can facilitate a trade. Last but not least here, another player that he mentions in his blog that's certainly worth monitoring is the situation between the Minnesota Wild and young forward Kevin Fiala. Now, he's been with the organization only a short time. Of course, previous general manager Paul Fenton made the acquisition after a trade with the Nashville Predators to acquire Fiala, and it really hasn't gone the greatest with him in Minnesota. He's been a healthy scratch a couple of occasions this year, and Coach Bruce Boudreau, even though he's referenced the fact that they can use his offense, certainly does not seem to be overly enamored with his overall game, and certainly has some concerns about keeping him in a lineup on a regular basis. Of course, the Wild as a whole have not had a great start to the season, and even though they'd probably prefer to move out some older players with longer term contracts, that's going to prove to be very difficult. And moving a player like Fiala, if he's not fitting in, would certainly be a lot easier. He does have a lot of potential still, had some productive time with Nashville before the trade, so I do think there would be plenty of interest there. So clearly I think it's a situation worth monitoring. He didn't mention any particular teams that have been scouting Minnesota or that might be interested, but I do think if the Wild make it known that Fiala would be available for trade, I don't think there'd be any shortage of interest in the young Swiss forward to be acquired, because I do think he could certainly be a solid NHL player, likely be a 20-plus goal scorer if the right situation presents itself and he can play in the right type of lineup. So that is all your news and notes for today. Of course, as always, want to know all your thoughts and opinions and everything discussed in today's video, so let me know what you think down in the comments and we'll continue the conversation. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content, and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it as well. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I will catch you next time.